ago, when we first encountered Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria, I mentioned the religious hermits that he visited in the wilderness near his home when he was a young man. He took them food and basic supplies. Athanasius greatly respected these men who forsook the ease of city life to pursue undistracted devotion to God. Who were these hermits? And what moved them to such a radical departure from the lifestyle that had been modeled by Jesus and the apostles? While the theology of monks and monasteries evolved over many generations, its earliest expression drew from the example of John the Baptist, forerunner of Christ, who was something of an ascetic himself. His haunt was the Judean wilderness, where it intersected with the Jordan River. He wore a less than fashion-conscious wardrobe and ate a strict organic diet grudgingly provided by the wilderness. The earliest hermits put great weight in Jesus' counsel to the rich young ruler to sell his possessions, give the proceeds to the poor, and follow the Lord. They embrace the New Testament's recurring idea that the flesh and the spirit are at odds with each other. Assuming there was no reconciling them, hermits renounced the world by leaving a comfortable life in the city in favor of the absolute bare necessities of whatever living space that they could carve out of the wilderness. This lifestyle of deprivation and discomfort was regarded as the truest route to unhindered communion with God by hermits and their admirers. The first time that we see a written expression of this emerging mindset is in the Shepherd of Hermas, about AD 140. This early Christian document defines a higher and a lower route that believers can take in their devotion to God. Faith, hope, and love are the lower route required of all Christians. But those who aspire to closer intimacy with God, self-denial is required. This denial of self took many forms, with celibacy being one of the more radical yet more popular methods. The practice of penance became common with believers and moved to dramatic acts of charity and bravery in order to prove their devotion to God. When persecution was a frequent threat, Christians used penance as a way to compensate for moments of weakness and fear. And of course, martyrs were luminous heroes, even some pagans admired. But with the repeal of persecution, the church needed new heroes and found them in the hermits who engaged in extreme acts of self-denial. The earliest monks were hermits, individuals who took refuge in the desert, hinting at where they got their start, in Egypt, where the desert is plentiful outside the fertile strip of land along the Nile. The word hermit comes from the Greek word for desert. About AD 250, a 20-year-old named Anthony took Jesus' command to the rich young ruler to sell his possessions and follow him literally. Anthony sold everything and went to live in an abandoned tomb. Now, legends quickly grew up about his battles with temptation that took visible form and attacks by demons, seductive women, and wild beasts. Anthony emerged from each battle with a greater sense of devotion to God that inspired others to follow his ascetic example. And soon, hundreds were making their way to the wilderness to pursue a life of rigid self-denial. Anthony was Athanasius' favorite. Since Anthony lived to be over 100, he was alive when the future Bishop of Alexandria was taking supplies to the desert monks. Athanasius wrote a biography of Anthony, which became wildly popular. This book, more than any other influence, helped boost the esteem and appeal of the Hermetic life. Monasticism grew apace with the newfound imperial favor under Constantine and his successors. It's not difficult to understanding why the number of ascetics jumped and monasticism became popular at the same time that the church and the state were buddying up. Being a Christian was no longer dangerous, so the sincerity of many new members declined. And when people realized that belonging to a church was a social and political plus, the sincerity factor dipped even further. Genuine believers noted the sagging quality of faith among so many of the church's fair-weather friends and responded by embracing a more rigorous path. The models of that era were the monks, those standout Christian heroes who'd attained an honor similar to that given the martyrs of the previous era, and hey, I don't have to get my head chopped off. Cool. And so the monks of this time weren't so much fleeing the world as they were protesting a worldly church. Part and parcel of the Hermetic life was an isolated individualism that stands in contrast to the communal life modeled by Jesus and the apostles, and, may I say, was urged in the New Testament. You don't have much of a body of Christ when it's just one guy in a cave. Hermits found refuge in the wilderness, an easy way to avoid the temptations of the external world. But what of the far more dangerous inner temptations of the soul, things like pride and envy? The temptation to pride was obvious. After all, it was easy for the desert ascetics who'd taken the supposed higher path to consider themselves better than others. But how could envy be a problem when they lived alone? Well, they lived alone, but they had plenty of visitors. Pilgrims made their way out to meet them and catch a few moments with these that were considered living saints. As these pilgrims made the rounds of several hermits, they reported to each hermit the extreme act of penance and piety of the others. Not wanting to be outdone in a show of devotion, the hermits endeavored to surpass each other. They went on extreme fasts, ate bizarre foods, lived in trees, on tops of pillars, refused to bathe. As their acts became more bizarre, their fame grew, and soon thousands were flocking to see them. One hermit named Simeon Stylites, or Stylites, take your pick, was so put out by the crowds who came to see him, he erected a pillar that he lived on the top of for the next 30 years. People sent up food via a rope and a basket. Now, as with any extreme, it didn't take long before a calmer and more reasoned way challenged the decidedly non-biblical ultra-individualism of the desert hermits. About AD 320, someone remembered that Genesis 2 verse 18 says that people shouldn't be alone. Hey, maybe these hermits that we made into living saints aren't really hitting the mark after all. An ex-soldier named Pachomius formed the first monastery. It was a place where Christians could pursue devotion to God in a communal setting. Instead of each monk deciding for himself how to live and what to do, drawing on his experience as a soldier, Pachomius set rules for the community. All members wore the same uniform, engaged in similar manual labor, and kept the same schedule. While Pachomius's monastery was the first that we know of for men, women already had their own version of communal life. This had been necessary since women were not allowed to be hermits. Their isolation would have made them, a tempting target for criminals and brutes. Nonus is the feminine form of the word for monk, and so women who pursued the communal life were called nuns. Their cloistered commune was a convent. The monastic movement spread north out of Egypt into Syria and then west into Asia Minor, which at that time was the most spiritually dynamic region of the faith. And once monasteries took root in Asia Minor, they spread rapidly across Europe. As we saw in the last episode, when Athanasius died in the spring of 373, 3 bishops from Cappadocia and Asia Minor picked up and continued to carry the standard of loyalty to the Nicene Creed: Basil, Gregory of Nazianzus, and Gregory of Nyssa. Now, these 3 greatly promoted the monastic movement. Basil was especially important as he authored the rule of discipline that framed monastic life for generations after, and does to this day in the Eastern Orthodox Church. Throughout the 4th and 5th centuries, monasticism gained popularity and infiltrated every level of society. The communal life of monks reinfused the church with a sense of purpose and a return to the piety that had marked the church's early years. Martyrdom was replaced by a wholehearted devotion to God through renouncing a career of worldly success in favor of one that was lived in the imitation of Christ. In order to obtain this ideal within the context of communal life, monks took a vow of obedience, poverty, and chastity. These were attempts to limit the battle line of temptation and sin by renouncing possessions, self-will, and the sexual urge. Monasteries helped put an end to the problems that were common to the earlier hermits: idleness and eccentricity. They became centers of social renewal and scholarship. By the 6th century, most church leaders either were or had been monks. One of the most notable monks from this period was Jerome, who lived about 340 to 420. He began as a hermit in the Syrian wilderness. Despite best intentions, Jerome was plagued by sexual temptation. The only relief that he could find was when his mind was preoccupied by an overwhelming intellectual challenge. Someone suggested that he learn Hebrew, which for him proved to be an effective prescription against temptation. Once he'd mastered Hebrew, he traveled to Rome, where he became the tutor of one of the leading bishops and met a couple of brilliant women who, under his training, became as skilled as he in teaching the Bible. When Jerome fell out with some of the other monks at Rome, he moved to a monastery at Bethlehem, where he spent the next 22 years translating the Old and New Testaments into Latin. Now, at first, Jerome's translation was criticized because he used the street language of his day rather than the more refined classical Latin of antiquity. People considered his Bible vulgar, but it didn't take long before opinions changed and the Latin Vulgate was widely and wildly popular. The Roman Catholic Church used the Latin Vulgate as their official Bible until recent times. The man who had the most significant impact on monastic life was Benedict of Nursia, not far from Rome. Benedict was educated in the capital, but when he was exposed to the extreme asceticism of the Hermits, cut short his schooling in favor of a solitary life in a cave 80 miles south. He spent 3 years studying the scriptures when local monks came for a visit. Impressed with his learning, they asked if he would be their abbot, a monastery's leader. He agreed. But when the discipline that he required proved too rigorous for them, they tried to poison him. He fled. Benedict took little more with him than the wisdom born of failure. Instead of chalking up his ouster from the monastery as a sign that he wasn't cut out to lead, he refined his ideas on how to conduct a community and began a new monastery at Monte Cassino, just south of Rome, in 529. When Benedict died 13 years later, he left behind a pattern for monastic life that became the standard for hundreds of monasteries and helped safeguard European civilization during the intellectual declension of the Middle Ages, something that we'll turn to in a later episode. It was at and for the Monte Cassino Monastery that Benedict wrote his famous Rule. It was a brilliant merging of pragmatism and psychology. Benedict had learned how to administrate a commune of believers to enforce necessary discipline without being too harsh. He began by taking the basic monastic forms that were already in place, then installed a system of discipline that weeded out the lazy and insincere. He knew the only way to accomplish the aims of a monastery was by maintaining authority and discipline, but the required obedience had to be such that an ordinary person could give it. Benedict failed in his earlier attempt because he'd expected the monks to follow his own level of discipline, which he realized was greater than all but a few could emulate. Benedict's rule established the role of the monastery's abbot as sole authority to whom the monks owed unwavering and unquestioned obedience. But this authority couldn't be arbitrary, and so he made the selection of the abbot a choice for the monks themselves. His rule for the abbot was that any major decision must be made after consulting the monks for guidance. He warned that going against their counsel was both unwise and unsafe. He cautioned abbots against an unchecked exercise of power. In a move that seems prescient, Benedict advocated that each monastery become a world unto itself. Work of both manual and mental nature was seen as crucial to monastic life and central to devotion to God. So each monastery became a self-supporting community, dependent on the outside world for little. And what this meant was that as the Roman Empire disintegrated, the scholarship of the ancient world was preserved in the Benedictine monasteries, where it was read, studied, and copied for generations. They became the storehouses for the knowledge that would reemerge in the Reformation and Renaissance, lifting Europe out of the Middle Ages. As we end this episode, here are some lines from the Rule of St. Benedict. The first degree of humility is prompt obedience. Idleness is the enemy of the soul, and therefore the brethren ought to be employed in manual labor at certain times, at others in devout reading. The sleepy like to make excuses. The abbot ought ever to bear in mind what he is and what he is called. He ought to know that to whom more is entrusted, from him more is exacted. He should know that whoever undertakes the government of souls must prepare himself to account for them. Now, next time, we're going to take a look at one of the most gifted preachers of the early church, so eloquent that he was nicknamed Golden Tongue.